Hello, Paso County. Your County Commissioner for Precinct 2, David Stout, here once again. We are back with a deeper dive into some of the issues that touch not only Precinct 2, but the rest of the county. As a co-chair of the Complete Count Committee here in El Paso County for the 2020 census, we're definitely keenly aware of the needs of our region and a lot of the activities that are going on when it comes to what we're doing to get people counted for the census. And so for this month's Sunday conversation, we've invited one of my co-chairs on the Complete Count Committee, Liz O'Hara.
Yes,
welcome.
Thank you
for joining us.
Thank you for asking.
So Liz, in her free time, works for El Paso. Works for Texas Gas, but she's a resident of Precinct 2 and one of our constituents. Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the things that we're doing with the Complete Count Committee to help make sure that El Paso gets a full count?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Paso del Norte Complete Count Committee is just one very large committee of about 100 organizations. And so it's going to be education, faith-based, the business community. A lot of different people are coming in, and they are really the trusted voices. And the reason that happens, and you may have already explained this, in many of your outreaches, is that the government itself is the entity that puts out the census. But in our community, there's going to be some fear of the government. And so the people who can help to disseminate that information are going to be the trusted voices, the people who interface with our population on a day-to-day basis. As you know, we did some research last fall about why people wouldn't participate in the census if that's what they were saying. And a lot of it came down to they didn't know why they needed to participate. There was some fear, but really they just didn't make a connection. How is my life affected? And so what we do as a CCC is make sure that those individual groups that are going out there, the clinics, the churches, if we have priests who are talking, that they're well informed about what's going on and can explain to people why they want to do this and what is tied in their life to the census so that we can increase that participation. El Paso has a lot on the line this year. We have so many things that we stand to lose if we don't participate. So for instance, you and I both have children, and we talk a lot about in our communities about education and oftentimes not being recognized by the state as being an impact market or an impact community, a growing community. And so if you have an issue with the fact that you have 30 kids in a classroom when really we could have 22 in a classroom, making it easier for the teachers as well as the students, that's part of this funding, because the population base is what the state will be looking at and saying, oh, hey, we need to be looking at the potential for a new school. We probably need to have so many more teachers. We can't have so many kids in one class. So it comes down to things like that. So, everything from roads to medicines to classrooms, the census touches everything that we do. And a lot of the reason that we have struggles today is because we didn't have great participation in 2010. So if you look at what has happened in our community since then, we have a new hospital on the east side as well as in Northwest El Paso. 10 years ago, we didn't even really use the phrase Northwest El Paso. There was, the Upper Valley, a swath of land, and then the outlet shops. And now think of all of those homes that are out there, the schools that have been built. None of that exists on paper as far as the U.S. government is concerned, because that happened after 2010. Same thing with East El Paso. So you've got that new Hospitals of Providence, all of those homes, the schools, all of that. None of that really exists as far as the U.S. government is concerned. So we would need to get funding for that. When you think about the people who fled the violence in Juarez, that has happened from 2010 to now. So they don't exist on paper in our community. We need to be able to make sure that anybody who is here, whatever their status, that they get counted, because we are dependent on that.
Definitely, and I think another important aspect of being counted has to do with our voice and our representation.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what that means and how we could be negatively affected?
Sure. So
in that realm?
Sure. So one of the most important parts of the census is our representation in the state, and so that's our state delegation right now. If we do not show a population growth, in fact, if we stay stagnant, then what happens is in the state legislature they start looking at how to create the boundaries of who is represented by who from west to east. So they'll start with El Paso first, and then they start going in that direction. So that means that they may say, oh look, El Paso is not the big bad city that they think they are. They talk a good game, but really people are fleeing El Paso, when in fact maybe that's not the case, they just didn't participate in the census. What the legislature will then do is redraw those districts and say, okay, El Paso, you've lost some representation here. Let's redraw those boundaries. And so you and I may be in one representative's district, and then that district changes people further east. I think that's Representative Gonzalez. Her district will have to go further out. And so now she's not just representing people out in like the Clint area, but it may have to go even further. And that's going to be a burden for her. Certainly, for the people who live out there, they want to have easy access to the people who represent them. And that's not going to be easy for us if our lines get redrawn.
But I wanted to talk a little bit about, you kind of hit on it a little bit earlier. You said the word hard to count communities. And so what does that mean, and how does that translate into kind of the obstacles that we have in actually getting a complete count?
So the way that the U.S. Census Bureau is looking at El Paso, for the most part, is they look at it in tracts. El Paso, by and large, is considered hard to count. So this is going to be a group of people who may not feel the urge to participate in the census. And it may be because they have a fear of the government. It may be because they're not documented, and so they feel that participation may accidentally out themselves and their family. Again, the testing was showing that a lot of them just really couldn't make the connection here. Perhaps they feel like their English isn't strong enough and they don't realize that the census can be taken in Spanish, and so they consider them to be hard to count populations. Now, there are certain tracts that are going to be harder in El Paso to count than others. So for instance, if you're looking at South El Paso, that's going to be a hard to count tract. However, if you look at El Paso as a whole, we have enough of those that in general El Paso is considered hard to count. But when you're looking at those outlying areas, Westway, Anthony, San Elizario, a lot of our county areas, South El Paso, the Valley, the lower Valley, those are going to be parts of Northeast El Paso. Those are going to be really hard to count areas. And so, as the CCC, what we really want, and I think this is important to remember, and maybe we can emphasize this a little bit, this is the first time that people have the opportunity to participate online. And so we really want to see that participation be very strong, especially in those areas in the first 8 weeks of this. Because for those hard to count areas, what will happen is if you don't participate in the census, the national enumerators will end up coming and they knock on the door. You and I don't probably open our doors now, and we have nothing to fear, but we buy our Girl Scout cookies somewhere else. We buy our world's best chocolate somewhere else, right? We don't even open the door for the FedEx guy, and he's bringing something that we ordered, right? People who are afraid are definitely not going to be opening their doors. And so what will happen, from what the census has explained to us, is they will go to your next door neighbor and they'll say, hey, so we can see that through the years the O'Hara family lived here on such and such a street, and they have 3 kids. What do you remember the names of those kids? You remember how old they are? Now that would weird me out if my neighbor said, hey, there was somebody around here poking around asking questions about you and your husband and your kids. And I have nothing to fear, right? But imagine if I do. Now that's even worse, because now you're kind of living into the fear of, oh my gosh, they're tracking me. How did they know? And so we don't think that we're going to get a great count if people are being asked in that way. We're going to combat it as much as we can, but those hard to count areas, we really need to reach out to them, ensure to them that this census is above board, that it is safe, that their information is protected, that it will not be used against them in any way. The law says absolutely not. And that was, and it's kind of all set up from about a year ago when we were hearing a lot of conversations about whether there was going to be a citizenship question attached to the census. And of course, now we know Supreme Court knocked that down. That is not the case. So the census is literally 10 questions. And so we tell people it's about 10 questions, 10 minutes, more or less. But that fear was already starting, and that conversation was starting here in El Paso, in our area, a year ago. And then, of course, we had the shooting that happened, scared people even more. And now, there's this mythology that goes along with the census of if you tell people, listen, I live in this home and I've got 3 kids and these are their names and what have you, that the government is going to force the census to turn that over. It's absolutely not. It's confidential and it's locked up, but we need to know who is here. In spite of whatever documentation they have or don't have, they live here. The census is not a citizenship test. It is about who lives within the boundaries of our country on a particular date and time. And that's it. Who is here?
So speaking of that particular date and time, Census Day is April 1st. Can you talk a little bit about some of the important dates other than April 1st we're looking at, not just in being counted, but also some of the events that our group is setting up to try to help people be counted?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first big date is going to be March 12th. So what day is today? We're a couple of days out, like about a week out, more or less. And that's really going to be when people in our community start to get in their regular mail the heads up of the census. Hey, the census is now up, and starting on March the 12th, you can start to self-identify. So if I get one of those in my house, I can either go online, or I can call, or I can fill out the one that I got and say, I live here, this is my name, these are my kids' names, this is what my occupation is, and I can be counted. So that starts March the 12th. For us, it's a really big deal. It's also important to remember that not everybody in the community gets that, mailer all at one time. They're kind of staggered. So 79936 might get it before 12 gets it. But eventually everybody does get it. Starting on March the 12th, that's going to be a really big date. That's when people can begin to self-identify. And that self-identification goes from March 12th until May 12th. In the in-between, we have National Census Day, which is April 1. That's the date that everybody typically thinks of as Census Day. And then the CCC, we have activities going on that day as well as that weekend, and we can get into that here in just a sec. Then May 12th is the last day that you can self-identify. And then starting on May the 13th, that's when the enumerators begin to say, okay, let's look at this neighborhood, who has already, called in or gone online. Oh, we didn't hear from these people. Looks like they've been there for a while. Let's head out to their neighborhood and start knocking on doors. Again, we don't think that that's going to be super successful. So for El Paso County, we need that first 8 weeks, March 12th to May 12th, to be the big push. And then this goes on, the census, I believe, goes on until July the 31st, and that is when it is done. In August, the individual census offices that have been deployed all over the country begin to shutter. The census will be done.
Oh, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. So I have one last question for you, and it's off topic.
Okay.
It's something that we've been doing is, when you're not, working really hard for Texas Gas, and when you're not working really hard for the census outreach, what do you like to do in your free time?
Oh gosh. What do I like to do in my free time? So I'm going to sound like a big nerd. I'm a big reader, so I'm always reading. What else do I like to do? And I work in my yard a lot, so it's not super sexy. I'd like to be able to tell you that I'm like, building a Mount Rushmore somehow that I would, unveil on the Franklin Mountains, or painting. I'm not talented like that. Getting in touch with my inner rock star. I don't have anything that cool. Yeah, no, I do a lot of volunteer work.
Great. Well, once again, thank you so much for your time and for your dedication to the community and making sure that we all get counted.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.